Welcome back to The Explainer. Our whole goal here is to take some really big, complex ideas and boil them down into something clear and hopefully pretty engaging. Does modern life ever feel just chaotic? A bit rootless, maybe? Like we're constantly in some kind of crisis? Well, way back in the early 20th century, one philosopher said, hey, that feeling, it's not just in your head. He argued it was the defining feature of our entire era. And that philosopher was René Guénon. Today, we're diving into his major work, The Crisis of the Modern World. Now, this is a really radical critique of Western civilization, coming from what's called a traditionalist perspective. It's a challenging read for sure, but absolutely fascinating. All right, so first up, a crisis of an entire age. Guénon kicks things off by taking a word we use all the time, crisis, and basically tells us we're thinking about it all wrong. See, for him, it all goes back to the Greek root of the word, krisis, which means judgment or a final verdict. So a crisis isn't just some tough spot we're in. It's the result. It's the final judgment on an entire civilization. And here's the kicker. He argues the crisis isn't an event in the modern world. The modern world is the crisis. So we're not just talking about an economic crash or some political squabble. No. For Guénon, this is way bigger. He's saying we are living at the absolute end of a massive historical cycle. We're at a point of total dissolution that he believes has to happen before any kind of real renewal can take place. Okay, so the big question is, how did we get here? Well, Guénon points to one single massive cause, our break with what he calls tradition. And when he says tradition, and notice that capital T, he's not talking about, customs like Thanksgiving dinner or singing old songs, not at all. For him, tradition is the whole shebang. It's the transmission of timeless, you could say superhuman, truths and principles that are the bedrock of any stable civilization. To explain this, he leans on the Hindu doctrine of the Four Ages. It's a fascinating framework. Basically, it flips our whole idea of progress on its head. Instead of history being a straight line up, he sees it as a gradual descent, moving further and further away from the spiritual clarity of a primordial golden age, down through a silver and bronze age, right down to where we are now, the dark age, or the Kali Yuga. And in this view, the modern West is the final, most materialistic, most spiritually dark phase of this entire cycle. So yeah, all our supposed progress, he sees it as coming at the expense of something way more important. Okay, so that's the diagnosis. But what are the symptoms? Let's get into what Guénon calls the cult of action. Guénon's big argument is that the modern world is fundamentally inverted. It values lower things above higher things. And the first and maybe biggest inversion he points to is our relationship between action and contemplation. So if you look at pretty much any traditional view, he says contemplation, that is, the pure knowledge of principles, is always superior. Why? Because it's the source that gives any action its meaning. But in the modern world, we've completely flipped it. Action is superior. We glorify constant external activity. Think about hustle culture, right? It's this obsession with frantic, aimless movement, and we completely mistake all that motion for actual progress. And Guénon has this great quote to describe it. He calls it a dispersal into multiplicity, a veritable disintegration of human activity. What he means is that all this constant motion without a higher principle to guide it just leads to pointless agitation. It breaks everything apart. All right, on to the next section, knowledge without wisdom. This is the second huge inversion that Guénon talks about, and it has to do with the very nature of science itself. This comparison here is absolutely crucial to his whole argument. On one hand, you have traditional or sacred science. This was always connected to metaphysics. It aimed for universal understanding, seeing the physical world as just one piece of a much bigger spiritual puzzle. But modern or profane science, it cuts itself off from all of that. It only studies the material world, fragments knowledge into a million little specialties, and really only cares about practical applications. And he gives a really powerful example to illustrate this, the journey from alchemy to chemistry. He says modern chemistry didn't evolve from alchemy. It's a degeneration of it. See, traditional alchemy was this deep cosmological science full of spiritual meaning about transformation. But then people started misinterpreting the symbols, taking them literally. They lost the deeper meaning. And what was left? Just the material residue. And that became modern chemistry, focused only on physical reactions. So, for Guénon, modern science might be proud of its huge collection of facts, but it has completely lost the wisdom that gives those facts any real meaning.
You could say we've traded depth for breadth, sacrificing true understanding for industrial application. So after all that, a pretty bleak diagnosis, right? It kind of leaves you wondering, is there any way out? What's the final prognosis here? Is this the end? Or is it a new beginning? Well, Guénon's outlook is pretty stark. He says the crisis can't be stopped midway. There's no reform, no turning back. The modern world has to run its full course, all the way to its ultimate dissolution. But, and this is a big but, this isn't just a catastrophe. As he says, the end of the old world will also be the beginning of a new world. Because in this cyclical view of history, the complete dissolution of one cycle is the absolute precondition for the birth of the next one. It's only after everything is crumbled that there can be a return to tradition and those first principles. So in a way, the darkest hour really is just before the dawn. And that leaves us with Guénon's final question, really. Is the dissolution of one world the necessary price for the birth of another? Now, look, whether you find this whole diagnosis compelling or you think it's just deeply flawed, you can't deny that Guénon forces you to take a hard look at the fundamental assumptions of our modern age. It makes you ask, what, if anything, have we lost in our relentless march of so-called progress?